Lars Garshol is one of the most prolific writers in the world when it comes to historic farmhouse brewing techniques. His blog about farmhouse brewing was one of the coolest reads out there when I was first starting my personal homebrewing education. Well, today we're going to talk to Lars, all the way from Norway, about his upcoming books and historic brewing techniques, today on Homebrewing DIY. Building recipes and taking good notes are two of the key fundamentals of making great beer. This is one of the first things that you learn when becoming a new brewer. I started taking notes on a sheet from my extract kit and then quickly moved to brewing software. I've tried many different types of brewing software, and then I found Brewfather. This is the one piece of software that you need for recipes and very detailed brew day notes, as well as fermentation notes. Brewfather also integrates with some of the topics that we discuss on this show, like the till hydrometer, the ice spindle, and ferment track. You need no other piece of software than Brewfather. One of the best parts of Brewfather is that you can try it for free. All you need to do is head to our website, homebrewingdiy.beer, and click on the Brewfather banner to sign up for free today. Once again, that's homebrewingdiy.beer and sign up for Brewfather today. Have you ever wanted to make a podcast? Do you have a subject you want to discuss with listeners? Do you even know where to start? Well, if you want to make a podcast and you want to get started now, I could not recommend Anchor enough. Anchor is the easiest way to make a podcast. Anchor gives you everything you need in one place for free, which you can use right from your phone or computer. Creation tools allow you to record and edit your podcast so it sounds great. They'll distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard everywhere: Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and many more. And you can easily make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. Hey, look. I shopped around for a place to post my podcast, and Anchor was the easiest, most streamlined experience you could ask for. So if you're looking for a place for your new podcast, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Once again, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. And welcome back to Homebrewing DIY, the show that takes on the do-it-yourself aspect of homebrewing. Gadgets, contraptions, and parts, this podcast covers it all. Today, we're talking to Lars Garshol about his upcoming book and his adventures in learning about historical brewing techniques. But first, I want to thank all of our supporters over at Patreon. It's because of you and your support that you keep this podcast coming to you every week. If you like the podcast, head over to patreon.com/homebrewingdiy and give monthly at any amount. We have a cool Patreon special going on right now, so the first 20 people at the $1 level get a logo sticker and access to our ad-free RSS feed. I'd also like to thank our newest supporter, Kenneth Raymond. Thank you for taking the time to head over to Patreon and support this podcast. Once again, if you want to support the show, head over to patreon.com/homebrewingdiy. Another way you can support the show is to go over to ratethispodcast.com/homebrewingdiy. There, you're going to get a direct link to be able to rate us on Apple Podcasts, podchaser.com, and your rating is going to help other homebrewers find the show. The last way you can support the show is to use our sponsor links on our website, homebrewingdiy.beer. Click on the Brewfather and Adventures in Homebrewing links, and your prices will stay the same, but then they'll know we sent you and they'll support the show. I also got some feedback this week from Ed Maurer. Ed says, "Hey Coulter, I love your podcast and the DIY of homebrewing. In fact, I think I enjoy the tinkering and building stuff as much or more than making beer. Today, as I'm finishing my newest brewery, third move in 3 years, I realized how much home-built and repurposed stuff that I have throughout it. I thought it would be interesting to share with you. Examples: Brewing table is solid wood door sitting on two sawhorses built from used concrete forms. My bottle washer and carboy cleaners are made from sump pump and salvaged copper pipe. A grain mill built with a 30-pound linoleum roller, exhaust pipe, and other miscellaneous parts. I'm actually kind of curious about that grain mill. I'd like to see an image of that. And then a rolling bottle dry rack based on office chair parts and PVC pipe, a brew kettle vented with a bathroom fan and a removable cellar window panel, and DIY wired STC pump controller on a 35-year-old dorm fridge fermentation with a heater. Also using the STC to control an aquarium heater to manage bottle conditioning in my cold cellar. Probably a bunch more stuff, but you get the idea. Most of these evolved from ideas, and then I picked up while roaming the internet. Cheers, Ed. Well, Ed, thanks for the feedback. And yes, I agree. As I look back even at my brewery, there are many homebrewing projects out there that I've been working on all of the time, and it's just always something to add to my brewery. As a matter of fact, my Keezer to this day is being run by an STC 1000 temp controller that I made back in 2014. It's been going strong for a long time, and once again, I got to say thank you, and I hope that this third brewery of yours is your best yet. If any of you listening have feedback and would like to send it in, you can always email us at podcast@homebrewingdiy.beer, or head over to our website, fill out the contact form, or just hit us up on any of our social media. Just look for @homebrewingdiy, all one word. Now, let's just jump into our show where we're going to talk to Lars today on Homebrewing DIY. I'd like to welcome Lars Garshol to Homebrewing DIY. Welcome, Lars. How are you?
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the show. I think the first place we want to start in our conversation today is just really how did you get into homebrewing in general, and how did you get started?
I actually never got into homebrewing at all. I call myself an away brewer because I visit people to see how they brew. I have brewed a couple of beers, but it's only to test recipes, really.
Okay, so really your hobby is to travel and experience other people homebrewing, really, then, right?
Yes, farmhouse brewers specifically.
Yeah. So tell me about how you discovered farmhouse brewing and kind of how that has turned into such a passion for you.
It started with, of all things, a book my wife gave me for Christmas. It was a Danish brewer, Per Kølster, who wrote a book about, he had this idea he was going to create Nordic beers with Nordic flavors, and he wanted to look at the farmhouse brewing traditions for inspiration. And that was the first time I got any real insight into it. And there was particularly one chapter that struck me about this Lithuanian farmer who malted his own barley, and they had the yeast in a jar in the well and stuff like that. So I figured maybe Lithuania would be an interesting place to go to.
And so you ended up traveling to Lithuania and seeing that. Is that correct?
Well, it was a longer process. So I mean, getting to Vilnius from here is a 1.5 hour flight. It's no big deal.
Okay.
So I just flew there, went to a bar, ordered a beer, and was flabbergasted because it was like no other beer, really.
What was the difference between that beer and the beer you had been drinking up until that point?
It was totally different flavors. There was this massive, vivid straw flavor. Like you have a bale of hay that bakes in the sun all day, and you drop face first into it. It was really amazing.
So it kind of had a more kind of earthy flavor to it that is something I think is very traditional amongst a lot of different farmhouse flavors that I've tried personally. What do you think that it was that really I guess what really kind of drove you, like like what behind finding these farmhouse breweries and the process? What was it that you felt that was really fascinating to you personally?
I was mainly the sense of mystery, because it was so incredibly difficult to learn basically anything at all. And it started right with that first beer. The bartender had recommended it to me, and when I tasted it, I ran straight back to the bar and I asked her, how do they make this flavor? Is it the hops or? And she just looks at me. What is hops? And I realized that this isn't gonna work. I'm not getting any answers here. And it's been like that the whole way. That normally, if you want to know about some type of beer, you read about it online or you find a book. Here there was nothing, just a total blank.
Well, and it's kind of like when you walk into some place that's been doing the same thing for so long, it doesn't need to be written down, right? It's just, this is beer. What is it? Like, it's beer. Is that kind of
Yeah,
the mentality you ran into when you first started discovering these things?
yeah. Well, it took a long time to actually meet the people who make the beer, but yeah, that is the way it works. So typically, you learn to brew from your parent when you're, you know, in school, and then eventually you start brewing for yourself, and then you just know what to do.
Yeah, it's like cooking with your grandmother when you were a kid. Same idea, right?
That's a very good comparison. It's exactly like that.
Yeah, and then it's the same traditions passed down family to family, and the way that my family makes beer may not be exactly the same somebody a few miles away makes beer. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
So
I had
my
on Gotland. I had this. I met one brewer and talked to him how he brews. He made raw ale. Then I drove, I don't know, 10 minutes. Talked to another guy. He doesn't boil the wort. That's not going to be beer. Was the reaction from the other brewer.
Yeah, it's kind of it's I to me and this is just a personal thing, but I feel like and back to the grandma analogy, it's that farmhouse ales to me are the equivalent of home cooking, and so that's
Yeah,
personal.
yeah,
So my question is that you started a blog going through your travels. I gotta be honest with you. I've read your blog multiple times since I've started home brewing over the years. How did what was the intent of the blog? To really just document what you were seeing? What was the idea?
Well, actually, I started the blog before I got into farmhouse brewing, and the idea with starting it was just there were things that I wanted to say, and this was a place to put it, basically. And then, of course, when I started discovering the farmhouse tradition, it was natural to kind of that was the thing I wanted to talk about. So that was what I blogged about, and then, of course, I saw that this stirred up a lot of interest. So that made me more interested in writing it, and of course also I wanted to document it, like you say, to finally get some of this stuff down on paper. Well, not
Yeah.
paper, but you get the idea.
Yeah, totally. I totally get the. It's out there in the world for people to find, right? And I mean,
Yeah,
for me, your blog is the first time I ever saw somebody putting spruce tips into a beer, and I know that seems pretty common these days when it comes to a farmhouse ale. But for me, it was that was the first place I ever saw something like that, and it's really cool. How many different places have you traveled to look at different farmhouse ales?
oh my god, a lot of places in Norway, both in western, eastern, and central Norway. If we do, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 different places maybe. um, I went to Gotland in Sweden, the island of Mön in Denmark, a whole bunch of places in Finland, too many to count quickly. Went to Estonia, several different regions there. Latvia, a lot of places in Lithuania, 3 different regions in Russia. That's it, I think.
Okay, that's a lot of area to cover. Uh, one of the things that I think that Europe has that we don't really have here in the States is that your farmhouse traditions date back hundreds and thousands of years. I think that just the way that the United States used prohibition kind of really killed our farmhouse traditions, and kind of after that we went to like industrial sized brewing, right? What was some of the I guess the best question right now would be like, what are some of the experiences that you had that were probably some of the most profound experiences you had in your travels? Do you have any like kind of stories out there of some farmhouses that kind of really changed the way you thought about brewing in general?
It was especially in the beginning that it changed how I thought about brewing. Particularly the first one where I was asking him, so why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And this guy, in addition to being a farmhouse brewer, he's actually a climate scientist. He's a razor sharp guy, really, really smart. So he wasn't used to not knowing the answers, and it was kind of embarrassing for him that this is kind of chemical questions and he can't answer them. He has absolutely no idea. So he was just saying, no, I don't know. And then um, he started telling me about when his mother taught him to make pork steak. She said you have to cut off the ends of the steak before you put it in the oven. And he, of course, asked why, and she just said, no, that's how we do it. And then he did the same for many years until he asked his grandma a long time later, and she said, well, that's because our old oven was too narrow. There wasn't actually any reason to do it, but he didn't know. And of course, he's implicitly saying, right, that it's the same with this brewing. I was taught that you've got to do this stuff in this order, but I don't know if it's necessary. I just know if I do it, it's going to be good beer.
Yeah, and it's the thing that they were taught. They get to the process, and it always kind of turns out the way it turns out. Is kind of yeah.
But of course, what this really means is he can only brew that beer.
Exactly.
He can't design a beer. It's impossible. He doesn't have the theory.
Yeah, so like if you were to go to him and say, "Hey, this is what an IPA tastes like. Could you make it?" He's going to be like, "That's not beer."
He might be, or certainly he's gonna say that I don't know how to do that.
Yeah.
But if you gave him a recipe, then I don't think he would have much difficulty.
Yeah, well, the process of making beer, I think, ends up becoming the same. You still have to mash, you still have to boil, you still have to ferment, right? Like those processes don't change unless
Well, they
you
do.
But unless you do a raw ale, I guess.
Yeah, and there's other variations as well. For example, there are people who ferment first and lauter afterwards.
Okay, so
there are some really weird things that people do.
Okay, why don't you explain to me a bit about like fermenting first and then lautering afterwards, and kind of what, like, who does that, and what's the beer kind of like that you've tried?
Well, this process is documented from different places in Europe, and it's just one place where they say they do that, and then none of their neighbors do it. So it's spread out. You find it in Norway, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Belarus, but I think only a single person who brewed like that is still alive, and she's so old that she's basically she's senile. Her memory is gone.
Yeah.
So this tradition is gone. We don't know how it works.
There's
a Finnish brewer who tried to revive this method of brewing based on documents. And when he did it, he got his first three brews. He got three different results, and his problem is he doesn't know, is one of them right? Are all of them right? Are none of them right? He doesn't know.
Yeah, that's kind of an issue when something dies out, like a lost language or something like that, right? You may be able to go read about it, you may be able to scholarly look at it, but if you don't have somebody to verify that, hey, this is what it is this the right one? You hand it to them, and they're like, yeah, this tastes right. You don't have that, right?
Yeah, yeah. This is why it's so important that that people keep the tradition alive, because, like you say, it's like a language that gets extinct, or a species. Once it's dead, it's not coming back.
Yeah. Uh, you're in the process of writing a book right now. I think it's due to be released this year by Brewers Publications. How's that coming? And what would I expect if I went and got the book? What's going to be in there?
Well, it's kind of an overview of the world of farmhouse brewing. So it's about all of these weird brewing processes, why they are like that, what flavors they give, how to brew beers that way. Also about farmhouse yeast, farmhouse malts, strange ingredients like the juniper and so on. And also trying to look at the culture of this to give some context, so that the idea is to make people brew these beers, commercially and at home. But I felt that if I just gave people recipes without the background, it would seem basically almost insane, because so much of the stuff is strange. So that's why I decided I wanted to kind of present the broader picture.
Yeah, and I gotta be from a person who's going to read this book. To be honest, the background is just as fascinating to me as the end product, which is the beer, right? I love the stories of why people make things the way they do, why they use the ingredients they do, the tradition in which they come from, and then when I go and make that beer, it's something I can at least have. I think every beer has a story, and it's at least something I can be like, look, this is the way that they've made this beer in Lithuania, for example, and this is my recreation of that, right?
Yeah, that's kind of the thinking behind it, and I hope it will work that way. So I actually handed in the manuscript May last year.
And when
So we went through the editing, but this I should be done with this book now. I don't think there's anything more for me to do.
okay, when is the official release date?
April 7.
Excellent. And for those listening on around April 7th, you'll be able to uh, get access to this book on Brewers Publications, probably Amazon and all of the other booksellers that you would be buying your normal book beer books from, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Excellent. You talked about some in there when we were just kind of going through the book. You talked about different kinds of yeasts, right? And I know that like Kvike is kind of, at least in the States, is starting to take the brewing world by storm here. What other kinds of yeast did you run into through your travels?
There's quite a few Lithuanians who have their own farmhouse yeast. So some of those are home brewers, but also actually some of the commercial farmhouse breweries in Lithuania. There's also some brewers that still have their own yeast in Latvia. We don't really know how many. And then when I was in Chuvashia in Russia, it's about 800 kilometers east of Moscow. Um, it seems people there also have their own yeast.
And
And
what?
these,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
yeah, so these are not Kvike. They have uh, some similarities with Kvike in terms of their brewing properties, but genetically they are not related to Kvike at all.
And some of those properties are things like temperature resistance, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and also very fast fermentation. So yeah, this is one thing that the book is going to explain more. But the normal pitch temperature in farmhouse brewing, whether you're in central Russia or Suffolk in the UK, is body temperature.
And is that because they usually are pitching that in the same room that they're brewing? They're not getting it cold, chilled down all the way to like 60 degrees. Like, is
Yeah,
there environmental reasons on why that pitch temperature is that?
yeah. I think it's like you say, they don't have any cooling technology, so it takes a long time to cool. And this is basically just underneath the theoretical limit for how hot you can ferment at all. So
Yeah.
they must have somehow trained their yeast to handle this. They must have evolved to handle these temperatures, basically.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, to be honest, if you're looking at hundreds of years and many thousands of generations of yeast, it does start to really hone into the environment it's in, right?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's what's happened with the commercial beer yeasts that we know as well. They lived in commercial breweries for many centuries and adapted to the way the commercial breweries brew. So, in fact, the best temperature for yeast to ferment that in general is actually roughly body temperature. So it's not really the farmhouse brewers that are strange. It's the commercial brewers.
And it's funny you say that because I it makes total sense once you put it in that perspective. Yet when you're a home brewer and your goal is always to, at least home brewing in the States, and I think just like home brewing in general is people trying to mimic commercial beers. um it's something where you're like, well, that's the way it's done, and really farmhouse, if you think about it, is really the way it should have been done, right?
Yeah, it's well, the farmhouse world was kind of unknown, right? So
Yeah.
we everybody assumed that commercial brewing, that's how you did it, and nobody gave it any further thought.
Yeah.
But that's what's been so fun about discovering this, that you're finding that the world looks totally different from how you thought it was.
Yeah. And the other part of it is that when you think of it in those terms, and farmhouse brewing has happened for thousands and thousands of years, it's something where you're like, hey, this makes total sense. It's when you're like things like fermenting of foods, right? You ferment foods in a way that is not in a commercial sense. Like if I make pickles and I'm going to do a lactobacillus fermentation on my food, uh you're taking the natural yeast out of the air and off of the vegetables, and temperature is less important in that aspect, right?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. So, and when you look at those farmhouse yeasts, they're kind of symbiotic blends of those things. There's yeast, there's a little bacteria in there. There's, it's kind of if you think of it as kind of like a culture of a different blend, right?
Uh, it is definitely a culture, and there's many strains of yeast in those cultures. Whether there's anything else varies a lot. So quite a few of these seem to be free of any contamination at all, at least that the labs have been able to find. But in some cases, there is other stuff in there.
Yeah. And what are the different ways that, like, for example, through your travels, that people stored these yeasts for you repeatable in different batches, right?
Yeah, in Norway, the farmhouse brewers in the south generally keep them just in glass jars in the fridge. In the north, they usually dry them. So they take the slurry, smear it on baking parchment, put it in the oven, and get these hard, thin chips that they put in the freezer. But other places they do other things. Like in Lithuania, they put it in a jar and then lower the jar in the well because the temperature there is pretty stable. Um, but the Russians seem to mix it with flour and turn it into a kind of dough, so it was semi-dry basically.
Huh. Yeah, that's it's kind of funny to think of the different ways people are, storing it to, use in a next batch. Yeah, it still doesn't get contaminated, right?
Well, the Russian one was contaminated, but it made good beer.
Yeah.
So the thing is, this flour, unless it's flowers that's been treated to be sterilized, which I don't think this was, uh, then there's going to be other microorganisms there that you add to your yeast. So it's kind of strange that they do that, but apparently it works.
Yeah. And then you were also talking about just some different types of ingredients that you ran into, and what were some of the more outlandish ones that you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, I mean, the one that you referred to was juniper branches. That's one that seemed to have struck people with quite a bit of surprise. Because it looks odd, right? You go out into the forest, you take this tree, and you put the whole thing in your beer. But that's actually the second to hops. That's far and away the most common farmhouse spice. And many places is more important than the hops.
Yeah. I I,
Yeah,
I
but
could I could see that.
yeah, other ones I saw people using Miraca Gale, Sweet Gale. That was quite surprising. There was a guy who used blackberry leaves, but usually people don't mess around with strange ingredients a lot. It tends to be water, malts, yeast, hops, and juniper. And then a very, very few people use one of the traditional brewing herbs. And that's pretty much it.
Okay.
Historically, there was a little bit more variation. So there were some people using tobacco, for example, and there's a list of 5, 6 different common brewing herbs. But beyond that, there was very little.
Yeah. And in some of my earlier experiences, at least with posts from your blog, when I saw pictures of like the juniper branches being added to beer, I've also like seen it as an example of layering it in the bottom, so it can uh, uh, almost kind of like filter out of the bottom. Is that a normal use for juniper as well?
Yeah, it was extremely common. The other, there were two more things that were common to use in the filter. So one was basically straw, but very few people do that today. And also, for some reason, sticks of alder wood.
Hmm.
And the older wood adds color, a kind of reddish color to the beer, and I think many people wanted that. But then when you look at the documents, when people explain why they use them, then roughly half the people say because the older doesn't add any flavor, and the other half says it's because it adds such a nice flavor. So what does it do? Well, I don't know. I need to chop down an older tree and find out.
Yeah, but when you look at like even modern brewing, right? And we sit down with people and try to do taste tests and try to do it even in a scientific manner, the results tend to be all over the board, right? Taste is so subjective, and even if there's scientifically numbers that are different. So, for example, let's just say we do two beers that are fermented at two different temperatures. There are many studies where you sit down with 25 people and most of the people can't tell the difference, right?
Yeah, there is definitely a lot of almost superstitions in modern brewing as well. So although modern brewers have a good grasp of the chemistry and what happens, it turns out there's still a lot of stuff that we don't know and a lot of stuff that normal homebrewers believe that just isn't the case.
Exactly. And so for me it's like you know that also being said, it kind of even goes back to, we're talking about alderwood, right? Some people say it doesn't add flavor, half the people say it does, and it's kind of like they're still in that process because, and this is just a total speculation on my side, but the process of when you're fermenting this beverage, it is undergoing some sort of change that's biological through yeast, and we still don't totally understand what it does to the beer, right? On a like taste level.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah,
And of course, it's a tremendously complicated thing to answer as well.
exactly. But on the other hand, if you scientifically go look at it, and I'm sure that labs have done it and have gone through entire processes of fermentation and different stages, it's still hard to relate that to flavor.
Yeah, that's true. The flavor that's kind of where some of the magic comes in, right? That um, the flavor is so subjective and so complicated that the chemistry doesn't really describe it fully.
And I think that's actually the better way of putting what I was trying to say.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and so yeah, and through your different travels, uh, what would you say are some of the traditions that are still being carried on, and maybe some of the things that have kind of died out that you think that people will never get to really try?
Uh, yeah, I guess I should say that my biggest source of information is not actually the travels, but archive documents. So in the Nordic and Baltic countries, there were ethnographic institutes that uh, studied folk culture, and they collected huge archives of documentation about the farmhouse brewing. So, for example, when I talk about this thing with fermenting in the mash, my knowledge of that comes from these archive documents, and that's why I know about it, even though I've never met anyone who brews in that way. But can you do the question again? I sort of lost the thread.
Yeah. Sorry. The I think the right question is that you know, through your studies, the things that we taste today are really the things that have survived, and we talked about, how things could go extinct. What are maybe some of the things out there that you did in your studies that that people aren't doing anymore, and nobody's really tried?
There is a lot of that. What we have today is kind of just the tip of the iceberg, really, because uh, historically, every farmer in Northern Europe brewed their own beer, and in most countries, basically almost everybody were farmers. So the size of the tradition that's now gone is just staggering, unbelievably vast. So the list of stuff that's now dead is almost infinite. But if we're talking about techniques, uh, most of the techniques are still alive. Actually, most of the brewing processes. Um, but on the malting side, I guess that's where things have changed the most. Um, and there it's changed on several levels, actually. Uh, One of the biggest changes is to the grain itself. So when we talked about the yeast, I said there are many different strains in the culture of farmhouse yeast. It used to be the same with the grain that the farmers grew. That today the grain in the field is all genetically identical. It's copies of a single grain. But historical fields were not like that because the grain had never been purified. So when you looked at a field of grain, the plants were different heights. They often had different colors. They looked completely different from each other. And at least in bread baking, people say this kind of grain gives a totally different flavor, and in many cases, much better flavor. Um, but most of those kinds of grain are actually gone. We don't have them anymore.
That is fascinating. You don't really realize how the modern industrialization of farming has really kind of turned things into that monoculture that has really kind of changed the diversity in the grains that we're even making beer from, bread from, and kind of all those things, right?
Yeah, that's one thing that really surprised me when I started looking into this. And a lot of the historical malting methods are also gone. So For example, people who didn't have a lot of grain would often dry the malt in an iron pot. And if you ask me how that tastes, I haven't a clue. I don't know.
Yeah, and that that's kind of unheard of because even at the homebrew malting level, because there are people out there that are malting at home, they're still trying to mimic the industrial malting process, right? So
Yeah.
it's getting wet, getting it to germinate. The kilning is trying to still mimic that, and I would love to kind of see how maybe a farmer hundreds of years ago actually made malt at a farm level, right?
Yeah, that's actually a whole chapter in the book. So the stuff about the land races, the different types of grain, rye and oats and all of that, and also the germination and how they dried the malts. So there's drawings of the different types of kilns and that kind of thing.
Yeah, that sounds super fascinating and definitely something that I want to dive into. Uh, well, Lars, is there any kind of more brewing stuff in your future?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm still planning more travels. I have a list of places that I need to visit where people still brew that I haven't been, even new countries. There's also a list of archives that I need to visit to find more documentation. So the book is really kind of a report on a work in progress, I guess.
Yeah, and if you were to say the place that you haven't visited yet that you really want to go, where is it?
All of them, I guess. Well, okay, maybe Georgia, the country Georgia,
Yep.
obviously.
Yeah. Yes. The Eastern European country of Georgia.
Yes, yeah, we can dispute whether it's Europe or Asia. It's
Yeah, it's
on
really
the
close.
south side of the it's on the south side of the Caucasus Mountains, and usually the mountains are considered the border between Asia and Europe. But it's a Christian country, so in many ways it is kind of European.
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty amazing trip. Well,
It should be. They have amazing food. They also have actually fantastic wine. And this is also the one of the areas that more or less invented agriculture. So for example, the grain types that they have are completely different from the stuff that we know. There's, for example, types of wheat that make red bread that they have growing there.
huh. So the idea could be that the farmhouse brewing is also going to be very close to those different grains, right?
Yeah, because they will have made their own malts and brewed from that. So what does that do to the flavor? I don't know. It's also possible some of them still have their own yeast, which would be extremely interesting to see. Um, and I know they have some different types of brewing methods as well. So it should be very interesting to see what it is that they're actually doing.
Yeah, I will. I will definitely make sure that I'm reading your blog when you post those. I'm very very curious.
Thank you. Yeah,
Well,
this could take years though. I don't know. The main brewing area is not so easy to get to. There's there's one form of public transport, and that's a Soviet era truck that drives over a mountain pass in 3,000 meters. You have to stand in the back of it for 10 hours to get over.
wow, that's going to be quite a trip.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
Yeah, but I think part of at least your travels and your research is all kind of the adventure of the unknown, and really
Yeah.
just trying to learn what other cultures are doing and see how it revolves around our favorite fermented beverage, which is beer, right? So
Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely. Well, Lars, I want to thank you a ton for coming on the show and sharing with us the information about your blog, your travels, farmhouse brewing, and just your immense knowledge of all of these subjects. And I would like to also make sure to let all of the listeners know that, remember, April 7th is when his book's coming out. And if you're in any way interested in farmhouse brewing, it's a highly recommended read. I haven't personally read it, but I'm totally going to. But I am somebody who avidly reads Lars's blog and super excited to see what comes out of this book.
Great, thank you.
Hey, thanks for coming on the show, and thank you for giving me your time today. I'd like to thank Lars for taking the time to be on the show. It was a great conversation, and I learned a ton, and I hope you did too. If you want more information on Lars's upcoming book from Brewers Publications, head over to homebrewingdiy.beer. I'll have a link to that page as well as a link to his blog. Once again, head over to homebrewingdiy.beer. Well, that's it for this week, and we'll see you next on Homebrewing DIY.